Every night he dragged socks to the door, and the sound of fabric whispering across the hardwood became the only clock that told the house it was still theirs. It started as a small noise, soft, deliberate. At first, Sam thought it was the house, settling, old beams, pipes cooling, until he felt it through his chest the way a missing heartbeat feels like a bruise. A little scrape, a pause, another scrape. Then the weight of something soft pressed against the base of his bedroom door and stayed there, patient as breath. The light under the door was a thin, horizontal bar, the kind that looks different at 2 a.m. It looked like it might belong to someone else's life. Down the hall, the refrigerator hummed. Outside, a neighbor's late-night TV laughed somewhere, a distant, indifferent laugh. The city had gone quiet. Sam was awake because he had nowhere else to go. He rubbed his face with both hands and listened to the sock, the room smelling faintly of yesterday's coffee and the cheap aftershave he had stopped replacing. Morning had the same ritual. He'd look down, and the socks would be gone. On the first morning, he told himself he must have imagined it. He'd been up late, reading the same page of the same book until the words blurred. Grief plays tricks. Time plays worse ones. On the second night, the scrape happened again. Louder now. Closer. The sock arrived as if on a current, a tug along the wood that carried it right to the threshold. This time, Sam opened the door. There, not 3 feet from his slippers, was a single, damp, mismatched sock. Not his. Smaller than his, a woman's ankle sock, ginger with a faded stripe at the cuff. It smelled faintly of rain and detergent and something older, a scent that lodged under his tongue like a remnant of a forgotten line of a song. Sam crouched and picked it up as if it might burn him. The sock was warm in his hands. The faint dampness cooled quickly in the cool air. He looked down the hallway. No movement. The lamp by the stairs cast a long, thin shadow. He listened. He heard, very softly, a purr that sounded like a small engine. He turned, and there she was. Small, orange, the kind of ginger that passed for fire when it hit the light just right. Her belly was slightly rounded, not fat, but content. Her tail had a white tip that stroked the air with the politeness of a secretary tucking a stray hair behind an ear. Her eyes were 2 coins of green, and she watched him with the careful appraisal of someone who had been reassessing a human for a very long time. Sam had not named her. He had not yet allowed himself names. Names were tied up in the same box as everything else. Old photographs, a sweater with a missing button, the 2 coffee mugs that no longer matched, the place at the table where someone had once sat and hummed a tune while chopping onions. He let the cat keep all of it. He called her nothing. She called him an experiment in monotone strokes, with a sound like clearing a throat and the occasional command of a whisker. She didn't come when Sam called. She came when she decided he needed to be reminded he existed. She circled his ankles, at breakfast, with an air of mild reproach for living in a house that had lost its chorus. She pretended to be aloof, and then she dragged another sock to the door 3 nights later, and this one was his son's, blue, a small crew sock with a cartoon astronaut stitched into the heel. Sam swallowed. The sock was damp. There were tiny clumps of leaves in the cuff. He recognized the astronaut immediately. He had bought 3 pairs in a pack last winter and had put them away in the bottom drawer of a dresser he no longer opened. His boy had taken one for show and tell and never brought it back. In photos, the boy used to laugh with a gap where a tooth had been, and in frames, Sam still touched the outline of his shoulder like it was an afterimage. The sock felt like a message that had been folded into the world and left on the mat. He says he didn't cry then. He lied to himself in the way tired people do, by swallowing grief whole and dispatching it to the part of the mind that is trained to keep you upright. Instead, he put the sock into his pocket and walked to the kitchen, making coffee because the sound of the kettle felt like something moving forward. The cat watched him from the doorway, as if she had entrusted him with a secret and was waiting to see if he could carry it. This is how it began. Small acts of insistence from an orange-furred creature who did not come in at the nuisance of day. She was a night pilgrim. She came with offerings. She came with the kind of slow, stubborn devotion that didn't wait for permission. People around him called her a stray. The landlord called her a nuisance and left notes on the door that said, "No pets allowed." The neighbor asked if Sam needed anything and then added reflexively, he looked like he was managing. Sam said yes and no in the same breath. He was managing because managing is the only currency he knew how to spend. Sam had not slept properly since the funeral. He had not closed a door without thinking of the sound it made when his wife had used her elbow to nudge it shut. For months, the house had been full of lists. List of bills, list of things to say at the memorial, list of things the boy might need if he returned. Lists are cold. Grief is a warm, heavy thing that sits across a shoulder like a second jacket. The orange cat softened the edges. She brought socks like little flags into the doorway. She brought the world in and left it there to be examined. Neighbors started to notice. Mrs. Patel from across the street left a plate of cucumber slices on the stoop and said, "He's been lonely since the two of them left." Sam didn't answer. Words felt too large. He had a body full of phrases that he could not find the right windowsill for. He sat in the kitchen with his hands wrapped around the mug. The cat settled on the chair opposite him and watched like a patient therapist who charged with the currency of purrs. On the night the rain started, big, generous drops that hammered like a drummer with a secret, Sam woke to the scrape and the soft, wet tap at the door. He opened it slowly. On the mat lay 3 socks, arranged like petals, one small, one medium, one larger. They were all damp. Each of them had that same faint scent, rain, detergent, something else under both of those that his mind tried to pull into place and failed. He stood in the doorway, and the cat jumped up and pressed her head flat against his shin. The contact shocked him. He felt as if someone pressed a photograph against his sternum. He sank to his knees without thinking and gathered the socks up with both hands. For a second, the world narrowed to thread and fabric and the soft frenzy of a cat demanding attention. Then he laughed, a small involuntary sound that had no place in a house that had been set to autopilot. Sam had lived with rituals before. When his wife was alive, they were the kind that bound 2 lives in the small arithmetic of day-to-day affection. A coffee mug left on the second stair. A note tucked into a lunchbox. A song hummed into a bruise. Rituals are how ordinary people mark the passing of ordinary sacred hours. What the cat did was different. Her ritual was not about claiming territory or arranging favor. It was about remembering movement. She seemed to know that the house had ways of forgetting and wanted to hedge against it. He watched the cat and thought of the times he'd watched his boy run across the yard, socks half on, shoes unlaced, hair like an unmade bed. He thought of the small hands that once opened his palm to leave a sticker, the bold, clumsy stamps of a childhood that had lived inside the margins of his day. He thought about the last time he smelled his wife's scarf, how he'd held it to his face and let it carry him through an evening like a small raft. He had learned to measure time not in clocks, but in acts of care. Washing a dish, replacing a burned-out bulb, calling the neighbor back. Grief stole the scale from him. It made small things huge and huge things atomized. The cat returned scale in the most unscientific way. She measured time with socks. She filled the doorway with small proofs. Sam's phone sat on the hallway table with messages he had not opened. The icons were tiny little monuments to the world moving on. He felt guilty about not answering. Guilty in that heavy domestic way that felt like a second grief. He had stopped calling his mother back because the conversations made his mouth ache. He'd stopped going to the shop he'd once gone to on Saturdays because the shop owner would ask about the weather, and weather felt like a blatant thing to talk about next to everything else. He talked to the cat sometimes, not in full sentences, mostly in fragments, the kind people use to patch themselves to a function. "Little one," he'd say, "you came back." She would flick her tail and look at him sideways, like a coin deciding whether to roll. He started to leave a single sock out by the door on purpose. An experiment, perhaps a bribe. He left, one sock from a clean pair. He watched through the slats of the half-closed blinds as she took it away. She did, without fuss, dragging it with a dignity that made him smile, and then redouble the frown he had been carrying since the hospital. Sometimes the socks were not socks at all. Once she left a small ribbon, the coral of some forgotten gift, its ends frayed from the weather. Once it was a plastic hair clip that had seen a better summer. Once it was a note folded into a wayward triangle. No words on it, just a scrap of paper. Each object was simple, and yet each object felt like a dispatch from a different country. The cat was delivering ephemera from the outside, and with it, the sense that the world still had small inventories of meaning. Sam began to imagine where she went. Into the alley behind the bakery where rats held grudges, to the park where old men threw stale bread and discussed cricket with missionary fervor, to the hospital parking lot where strangers sat in cars and breathed. He imagined her a small pilgrim, moving through other people's lives, collecting what slipped and what was left. The image comforted him because it suggested motion. Movement is a promise. If something moves, there is hope that it may change its mind. At night, he would sit at the kitchen table and count the socks as if the act could be a ledger that made sense of weather and absence. He would tuck them into a wooden box under the sink. They were not holy, but he treated them with a reverence he hadn't known he was capable of. The socks were a language he could not parse but understood, like a child who knows the cadence of an adult's voice before learning the words. He slept better on nights she came to the door. He slept worse on nights she did not. The cat was careful about how she accepted affection. She allowed it in small increments, the brush of his knuckles across the top of her head, the occasional scratch under the chin. She would not climb onto his lap. She preferred to be beside him, to be within reach but not imprisoned. It was the kind of trust that fit a person who had been broken and was afraid of new seams. Sam understood restraint. He had worn it for months like a winter coat. He began to speak out loud to the empty rooms. It was a habit he'd promised himself he would never have. He said the names of things again, as if naming them would make them ordinary and therefore less dangerous. He told the cat about the boy's favorite cereal, about the sound of the front door at dusk, about how the house seemed to hold its breath when the rain came. The cat listened. Once, when he described the way the boy had once painted the backyard fence with handprints, she tilted her head so precisely that the line of her neck looked like a comma. Neighbors started telling stories of their own stray encounters, as if the cat had brokered a kind of community vote to remind people they were alive. The mailman left a note tucked under the doormat that said, "He seems better lately." Sam folded the note and put it in the mug drawer next to the spoons. He felt that odd, warm thing in his chest. The one that is not quite joy and not quite grief. Gratitude, maybe. The cat's visits had become a small scaffolding on which he could rest. Still, there were nights when the house screamed at him to remember. Those nights the cat did not bring socks. Those nights the silence felt like a fault line. He would walk from room to room, touching the ridge of a chair, running a fingertip along the spine of a book, as if searching for some remnant that would tell him he had been more than a man who learned how to breathe in someone else's shadow. Those nights the cat circled his legs as he walked and trailed behind like an insistence he could not avoid. He began, unthinkingly, to make tea in the evenings and sit at the window with the kettle hissing like a minor argument. The cat would jump to the sill and watch the rain and the streetlights with the intensity of a general. Once, as if in response to the exact shape of his loneliness, she dragged a gray, faded sock that had belonged to his wife herself to the door. He did not pick it up immediately. For a long time he stood and watched it, as if the sock were a tiny film of sunlight caught on a washing line, beautiful and wrong. When he finally bent, he pressed the sock to his face and inhaled. The scent was a world. It held the oil of hair, the perfume of a day when someone had smiled at a joke, the warmth of bodies shared on cold mornings. Sam let it fall from his hands, and the sock slipped onto the mat. He closed the door on the world and sat on the floor with his back against the doorframe. The cat came and placed her head in his lap, a small, compliant weight. In that moment, he felt something start to unravel and reweave itself. Not a fix, he would never say that, but a soft adjusting, the way a broken pot will be mended with visible cracks but still hold water. The cat did not replace the spaces that had been cut out of him. She offered a new texture to the days, an addition, a permission to feel. Even when the house felt like a museum of loss, she brought small objects that rearranged the exhibits. There was a tiny seed of something else planted in Sam's chest the night the cat left a sock with a small, puckered hole near the toe. The hole was irregular, like a map of something weathered. Inside the hole there were threads, and in the threads he thought he saw a glint of the boy's tooth, or a shadow of it. He could not tell if it was memory or imagination. He wondered whether cats keep secrets and leak them slowly to the people they choose. All of this accumulating quiet, began to do something to the pattern of his breathing. He had learned to count minutes like a miser counts coins. Now, for the first time in a long time, his chest eased between counts. He began to notice the small things again, the way light hit the coffee grounds in the morning, the soft tick of the radiator, the peculiar music the washing machine made when it finished a cycle. He noticed the gentleness of his own hands when he tied cords, when he wiped a rim, when he folded a towel. At the end of the first week of socks, Mrs. Patel knocked on the door and offered him a folded paper. She said had been left by some child who had been watching the comings and goings. The paper had a crude drawing of a cat with socks piled like a crown above its head. Underneath, someone had written in a shaky scrawl, "Thank you for letting her visit." Sam smiled then in a way that surprised him. The smile felt hesitant, like a person stepping into a shallow pool to feel the temperature. He let the cat jump onto his feet as he stood there, and she wound herself around his legs like she was anchoring him in a tide. He thought of names and discarded them, Ginger, Socks, Scout, then left them like wrapped presents and did not open any. One night, about 2 weeks after she first started bringing things, Sam found himself awake earlier than usual. He had been dreaming of the yard, of his boy running with socks flapping like small flags. The dream left a residue like static on the pillow. He rose and moved with the sort of automaticity that comes from a body taught to function without permission. The house smelled of rain-baked dust and the old lemon cleaner he used once a month because it gave the kitchen a smell that made him think of order. The scrape was there. He heard it without wanting to. A rhythm. He opened the door and the cat stood under the dim porch light holding, improbably, a shoelace. The shoelace was frayed. There was a smear of something on it that could be dirt, or could be memory. She sat and watched him like someone waiting to see if a story would be read aloud properly. Sam crouched and took the shoelace between his fingers. He remembered the last time he had tied a shoelace for his boy, the way his fingers had fumbled, and then found a rhythm. The cat nudged his hand. He did not know if he was being ridiculous, but the shoelace felt like a small key. He thought of doors that open into other rooms, into other possibilities. At that precise, fragile hour, something in Sam shifted. He felt the quiet knowledge of a new thing beginning. It was not a thunderclap. It was the soft, almost inaudible seed of hope cracking open. He did not know yet what the future held. He only knew that there was a small creature at his door every night with socks and sometimes ribbons and a ragged shoelace, and that this small, strange ritual had found him and stayed. He closed the door slowly, the echo of the latch a small punctuation. The cat brushed against his calf, then settled on the doormat, curling into herself like a comma waiting for the next sentence. Sam moved to the kitchen and made himself tea. He sat by the window and watched the street where a dog barked in the distance, and a late cab threaded its way around a stalled delivery truck. He looked at the wooden box under the sink and saw the socks piled like small patient promises. It was a beginning, not a resolution, not even a plan. Just a quiet, living thing that pressed itself into the shape of his life and refused to be ignored. He thought of the way rituals save us by making the world predictable again. He thought of how animals sometimes hold a map of human hearts without having to read them. Outside, the night drummed a steady, compassionate rain. The cat lifted her head and looked up at the sky as if listening for something only she could hear. Sam felt a movement under his sternum that was not all pain, something like warmth, a rearrangement of the furniture of his chest. He was tired. He was still a man with a long list of small, terrible things to do. But he felt the faintest tug toward the future, like a thread being pulled through the eye of a needle. Something had begun. It arrived in fabric and purrs, in the stubborn, unglamorous way of a creature who understood that small actions, repeated, become remedies. You're here listening, and that means more than you know. If you feel safe in these stories, your one subscribe helps me keep this quiet little corner alive. Thank you for being part of this peaceful world. He started counting the nights. At first, like you count stitches when you're trying not to think. 1, 2, 3. The cat arrived. The cat did not arrive. The cat arrived. The pattern made him feel as if something in the world still answered to rules. He liked that. Rules are small shelters. Grief had ripped the big ones away. Socks, for now, were a new kind. Days smeared into each other with the gentle insistence of the cat's visits. She became a weather system he checked for. He found himself waiting by the window on certain evenings without knowing why he had chosen that time. He learned the scrape of her claws on the stoop like the first line of a song. He learned the way she tilted her head when she wanted him to follow, the small, precise inquiry of her pupils narrowing into slits in the dusk. He started to keep the porch light on at night. It was a small thing, a kindness. Lamps are small beacons for creatures who make their own maps. The light created a shallow pool on the welcome mat. The sock offerings looked different there. Colors popped. The dampness dried faster. Once, a moth landed on the bulb and hung like a tiny coin. The cat watched the moth like a thing that displeased her sense of the universe. She left the moth alone and took the sock. Sam kept a record without realizing he was keeping one. It lived, in the small pocket of his memory reserved for tender facts. Monday, single white ankle sock. Tuesday, blue astronaut sock. Thursday, ribbon, coral, and frayed. He never wrote anything down. Paper felt too permanent. He kept the records in his head, in the soft ledger of late-night thoughts. The list gave him a shape to his days. Every visit had a different rhythm. Sometimes she would appear silently at the back door at dawn, trailing a sock like a confetti banner. Sometimes she would wait until he had returned from the store and leave the gift on the mat, as if apologizing for being late. Once she left a tiny, flattened bread crust, the kind you get from an old bakery that bakes too many loaves and then gives the ends away. It was stale in the way of charms. Sam put it in the trash without thinking, and then he felt a small pang of guilt, as if he had discarded an offering from a friend. She was particular about how she presented things. Socks were always placed with the opening facing the door, like an invitation. Feathers were laid along the threshold. Trinkets sat in a neat triangle. It was not chaos. There was an order. He grew to notice the order with the same reverence. He would notice a bruise forming, a slow signal of something important. He began to watch for the small cues that accompanied her visits. The way she liked the shadow of the hydrangea leaves on the porch floor. The way she could sit for a long time with her tail wrapped, eyes half closed, as if storing the sight of the moon. The way she would lift her paw and clean her face in, that methodical motion cats make, a tiny ritual within the ritual. He watched her when he thought no one could watch him. Sam's days carried on, but they carried differently now. The house seemed less like a museum and more like a place that could receive surprise. He let himself be surprised occasionally. He let himself laugh in a small, private way when he found a sock folded into the shape of a heart. It was ridiculous, but that kind of ridiculousness felt salvageable. He kept to small routines as well. He made tea at the same time every afternoon, a thin black tea that steamed in the cup and fogged the window for a moment. He would sit at the counter with his mug and the cat would leap up on the back of a chair watching him. The two of them shared silence the way people share a peninsula. Often he would talk without expecting answers. He told her about the garden he had wanted to plant. He told her about the yellow kite his boy had once flown until it caught a breeze and slid along the telephone line like a stubborn bird. "Have you ever had an animal wait for you, even when you didn't ask them to?" he asked the cat one evening, the question stepping out like a hand. The cat blinked slowly. She had an old, patient look in her eyes, as if she had been waiting for such questions her whole life. She did not have to say yes. The blinking was yes enough. That blink did something to him. It dismantled a small piece of the armor he wore. He had been training himself to live inside a constructed silence. The cat's attention was simple. It felt like a mirror that did not demand answers. He began to answer anyway. He told her about the funeral. He told her about how he had stood behind a podium and felt like a man reciting a recipe he no longer believed in. He told her about the small things that had accumulated afterwards. The way the curtains still smelled like a lemon. Cleaner, his wife insisted on, the way the curtains held the light differently when she wasn't there. He told her about the boys' drawings, crayon replicas of the sun with fat lines, stick people with proud smiles. He told her about the empty seat at the table. The cat listened. She would pad close and sit on the floor, her body a low, even presence. She did not interrupt his sentences. She let them be said and then removed them from his hands like a laundress accepting a fragile scarf. After he spoke, she would sometimes step closer and bump him gently with her head. The contact was a punctuation mark. It meant she heard. It meant the world was not fully vacant of language. Neighbors began to interact with both of them in a new way. Mrs. Patel would bring over bread and ask about his day. The mailmen stopped leaving notes and started staying for a minute to talk about the neighborhood. The boy from number 9, whose skateboard was the color of a bruised plum, started leaving the porch light on sometimes and said nothing about it. But it was a community of small courtesies, the kind that has nothing to do with grand gestures and everything to do with keeping someone visible. Work was a different story. Sam could not bring himself to go back to the office. His employer had been kind, in the way institutions are kind, with a sympathy that felt like a polite shade. He took odd days now. He worked when he could. He walked slower to the bus stop, so that the world did not seem to move past him in a humiliating rush. The cat became the measure of a day's success. If she came, it had been a day that had contained a small proof. Pets, or rather presence, changes the shapes of afternoons. He found himself noticing color more. The orange of the cat had become a bright that ate into the gray. When she sat at the windowsill, the light caught her fur in a way that made it look like she had been lit from within, as if someone had left a small lamp inside her coat. That inner glow made the house less stark. It fixed some of the edges. He grew to watch her sleeping. Cats sleep in positions that betray their histories. When she sprawled on the rug with one paw over her face, he thought of beaches and old sunlight. When she tucked herself into the crook of a chair, he thought of the way people hold on to memories like shawls. He watched how alert she could become in a second, ears attuned like tiny satellite dishes. She was always listening. He felt comforted by a creature that lived so vividly in the moment. It felt like a lesson. Sometimes she would disappear for a full day and Sam would be left with a raw impatience. He would walk the block slowly. He'd call her name out without expectations because calling someone else's name is a way to call your own back. He'd find her eventually, usually perched on a neighbor's fence like an inspector. He would scold her in a voice that sounded absurd even to him. She would look at him like a friend who'd taken a walk and returned with a story too complicated to be told in a sentence. People like to know where their animals go. It comforts them. They draw maps of the places that matter. He imagined her in the park, under the rhododendrons where old men fed pigeons. He imagined her at the hospital, sitting like an invisible volunteer whose presence soothed people at the edges of terrible nights. He imagined her on the stoop of the laundromat, watching the dryer doors like planets. She linked to other lives by the objects she left. Once she placed a faded button by the door, a mother-of-pearl thing with a crack. Sam knew it had belonged to someone else. The button looked like it had crossed several thresholds. He could imagine a hand that missed it every morning, a seam that had been frayed. He left the button on the mantel where light hit it like a memory. He did not ask whose button it was. Sometimes mysteries are gentler when they remain mysteries. Her clearest lessons were not delivered in big speeches. They were whispers. She taught him how to greet the day again. He learned from watching her move through morning chores with the economy of a being that knew how to allocate energy. He learned to rest in small stretches. He learned to let a minute be exactly a minute and also be a lot. Touch became easier. He discovered that small acts of care were things he could still do without breaking. He put out extra blankets when the weather turned. He washed the socks and dried them on the radiator, then folded them into a drawer that no one had opened in months. He started to rinse dishes more carefully. He watered the plant on the sill and moved it an inch to the right where the light seemed kinder. These acts felt like knitting. They took random pieces and made a fabric. The boy's drawings kept appearing in places Sam would not expect. Once there was a scribbled sun in the corner of the kitchen window, done in what looked like a permanent marker that had been left outside. He rubbed at it with a cloth until his hands ached. He could not decide if he wanted to keep the drawing, like a relic, or erase it so someone else could make new sunbeams there. He delayed deciding because it felt important. The cat had preferences that seemed to map onto his old life, and that made them both feel less alien. She liked the warmth of the laundry basket, the way towels smelled of the ocean they had never visited. She preferred his wool sweater when it lay on the chair, the one with a small moth bite. She would nudge her nose into the hole like she was collecting the scent history of a person. Sam let the sweater sit. He appreciated being allowed to leave things undone. Being allowed has the quality of mercy. They began to form an unspoken schedule. She would appear at the door after lunch sometimes. She would arrive late at night if the weather was good. She would not like thunder. He noticed the way she tucked herself into corners when thunder rolled like a big drum. He would sit up with her then, the two of them listening like companions at the edge of a story. He would run fingers across the scruff behind her ear, and that small space would feel like a repair kit for his chest. Days of silence still came. There were afternoons when the house swallowed him and made everything feel like a photograph of a life instead of the life itself. Those were the harder hours. The cat could not fill all of them. She could not reclaim birthdays or fix mistakes. She could not bring back a laugh or replace a hand. But she could make the shape of an ordinary afternoon feel less like a trap. She could open a window into the possibility of being held again. One afternoon, he found himself telling someone on the phone about her. He had not meant to tell anyone. Conversation had been a rare commodity. He heard his voice and noticed the smallness of it. He heard the other person respond in a way that was human and ordinary. "That's nice, Sam. Good." The response was faint, but the world did not collapse at the sound of it. He laughed at himself then and felt a small, astonished relief. The cat began to do something else that surprised him. She sought him out when he seemed most frayed, when his hands were raw from washing, when he had a face that showed the blueprint of a bad night. She came and curled in the hollow of his legs. She smelled like sun in alleyways. She would push her head into his shin with a small, insistent bump. He realized he wanted to name that feeling. Not love, not exactly, but an untranslatable compound that included relief and a softening of edges. He called it keeping. Keeping was practical. It was a verb. The cat kept him from slipping under the day by placing herself as a small, living obstruction. She forced him into small responsibilities. He began to wake and feed her even when he had no appetite. He began to brush her fur in the mornings, a short, formal ritual that became meditative. The bristles of the brush were rough and honest. They collected hair into a small, soft pile in the sink. He washed it down like returning something to the stream. There were slow revelations along the way. He discovered that the cat had a favorite place to sit in the window, where the light caught her eyes in a way that made them look like 2 coins he could spend. He discovered that she disliked canned tuna, but loved a particular brand of dry food he had thought to be unremarkable. He discovered that when she was frightened, she made a sound like a small exhale, the same sound he had sometimes made when he thought of certain memories. One morning, a little after dawn, he was making coffee when she climbed onto the counter and stood by the kettle. Normally, she hopped down immediately. That morning, she didn't. She stayed. She reached out and touched his hand with a tentative paw. It was a quick, tentative thing, as if she were testing the temperature of his skin. He froze. The contact was so slight that a rational mind might have called it insignificant. His chest disagreed. He felt the warmth of the paw travel like a message. He sat on the edge of the chair while the kettle steamed and his hands trembled. A little. This is where something small broke open. He sat down and let her come closer. He expected her to hop down. Instead, she stepped onto his lap. It was barely a foot up, a small leap, and then she settled, folding herself into a ball like a soft remnant of sun. Sam did not move. He let her be there. Her body was warm. Her breath ticked against his jeans. He realized as he sat that he had not let anyone onto his lap in a long time. He had avoided it the way a man avoids an old photograph, fearing that the act of proximity would make memories leak. He had been protecting himself with distance. The cat upended that protection with the economy of her small body. He put his hand on her back and felt the rise and fall of breath. The sensation was not miraculous. It was not an answer to his grief. It was a fact. It was the steadying of a small engine. He let his fingers follow the arc of her spine and discovered that he could move through a minute without falling apart. She stayed. For a long time. She slept. He allowed himself to relax. When the nap ended, he did not wake with the aching emptiness that had been his constant companion. Instead, there was a small buoyancy, a sense that he had been made less alone. This is the breakthrough. She trusted him enough to climb into his lap, not onto the floor beside him, not to brush his noodle of ankle, onto the place that meant a closeness he had not permitted. That climb was an act of faith. It was also a gift. He learned quickly what that trust meant. She allowed him to stroke her longer now. She would purr when he did it, a slow, vibrating approval. She would press her head into his palm and look up at him with an expression that was not merely animal. It felt like acknowledgement. It felt like conversation without words. The shape of his days altered subtly. He realized he had been holding his body in anticipation of pain. Now his body could relax into small comforts. News traveled slowly. A neighbor saw the pair through the window and waved. The neighbor offered a bag of dry food and a smile. The boy from number 9 drew a chalk fish in front of the step and left it there. The world around him softened in the small ways neighbors can soften when someone else's grief happens to meet their own capacity for kindness. Sam named the cat in his mind that afternoon. He had avoided names as if naming might trap the cat in a formal relationship he wasn't ready for. Now the name came like a sigh. He called her Socks in his head sometimes. He called her Ginger other times. He tried out names and let none of them stick on paper. He did not tell anyone. Names become containers, and he wanted the container to be clean when he finally used it. The breakthrough, this small seeding of trust, was not enough to dissolve all the heaviness. It did not bring back the past. It did not erase what had been lost. But it offered a new grammar for living. It gave him a new verb, to be kept. He was kept by a small orange animal who understood the worth of socks and the subtle logic of small offerings. The cat had taught him in the softest way that trust is not a guarantee. It's a bridge built one plank at a time. Evenings after that felt different. He would sit on the couch and read half a page and then look up to see the cat loafed on the rug, tail twitching like a pendulum. He would reach down and she would come to him. Sometimes she would leave something, small on the mat, and that would be both a message and a punctuation. Life was not fixed. It was a series of tiny agreements made between beings who showed up. The breakthrough held a fragile promise. It felt like a crack in ice where water kept flowing, dangerous and beautiful. He welcomed it. He kept it like the socks in the drawer, folded neatly, but not meant to be hoarded. He let that trust be given back and forth. It became the scaffold upon which he could build small comforts. He started sleeping better. Not all nights. Not by any measure perfect. But sleep became less like an obligation and more like a place where small repairs happened. He woke with less of the heavy lead of sorrow planted in his chest. He found in the mornings that there was room for coffee and a small news headline, and a muffled warmth in his jeans where she sometimes chose to sit while he worked at his table. The work of mending continued. There would be more seasons, and each season would bring a different test. There would be storms and missed days, and the occasional fear that this new pattern might be a trick. But the cat had offered him something that could not be unsewn. Proof that another living thing could choose him. That choice, repeated, made him feel less like an artifact and more like a person who could be relied upon. The cat's small trust asked very little. All she required was his presence, his ability to keep a light on, to keep a bowl full, to keep his hands gentle. When the part was over for that night, Sam brushed his teeth and stood at the sink. He looked at the cat sleeping on the rug like a comma in the sentence of his living room. He pictured the drawer where the socks lived, the small archive of unremarkable things that had become his evidence. He turned off the kitchen light, and the house felt like it had closed its eyes with him. He walked slowly to his bedroom, feeling the ease of a person who had been handed a small map. Everything had shifted not by a thunderclap, but by a sequence of small, steady steps. The socks were the opening line. The lap that finally accepted a warm, living weight was a chapter. Sam went to bed that night with the knowledge that someone else in the world knew how to wait. Someone else in the world had chosen to make his door a place of small gifts. He felt the fragile lift of hope, the kind that does not promise tomorrow, but promises to keep company with tonight. He slept. The cat dreamed on the mat outside, and in the darkness the house made the kind of little, small sounds that let you know it was still there. The morning would come, and with it, the small, steady work of days. He had a companion now who measured time in socks and in patient purrs. He had a creature who, in the plainest possible way, had shown him how to be kept. The cat's trust had broken the distance. That was the soft victory he carried forward. He began to notice patterns. Not at first. Grief makes the eye simple. It reduces the world to black and white details, what is missing, what is not. But patterns have a way of finding you, even when your vision is set to grayscale. The objects changed. They didn't come in random sizes anymore. They arrived like sentences that were learning to make paragraphs. Each one had a place of origin, an origin he could map with the kind of stubbornness people use to stitch meaning back into a life. At first it was socks. Then the socks gathered companions, a tiny plastic button, a ribbon, a shoelace, a crust of bread, a moth once, a small folded paper with nothing written on it. Once, tucked in the cuff of a sock, was a hospital wristband, mostly faded, ink, blurred by time and water. The band was the kind the hospital gives you when you poke and prod and the world tilts. He held it like a relic and smelled the antiseptic on its fold and some other faint smell that dragged him back like a current. He put the wristband on the counter, and it felt heavier than the fabric warranted. It carried noise, the low beep of machines, the wind in an open corridor, the whisper of shoes on linoleum. He had not been able to go back to the hospital. He had closed the door to that place like you close a book you are too afraid to read again. The wristband felt like a page turned, and then taped back in place. Sam began to keep the objects in a wooden box he left on the shelf above the sink. He did not tell anyone. He did not want the objects explained away by friendly logic. He wanted them to remain, for now, as puzzles. He wanted the possibility that the cat was doing more than scavenging. He wanted the possibility that there was intelligence in her small orange head. He wanted the possibility that there was a map, and that the map might somehow be meaningful. Neighbors started to comment. Small talk about cats is the world's least threatening gossip. Mrs. Patel smiled and asked if the cat had taken a liking to him. The mailman raised his eyebrows and said, "She leaves things for you, huh?" In that tone that is equal parts curiosity and approval, nobody knew where the cat came from. Nobody knew where she went. People invented their own endings to the story and then gave him the nicer ones. With every found thing, Sam's curiosity tightened into worry. The items felt personal now. The wristband suggested the cat visited places no ordinary neighborhood cat would loiter. Hospital grounds, maybe, where people wore thin smiles. The shoelace, the little clipped note. Someone somewhere was losing things, or giving them, or leaving them behind. He could not decide which scared him more, that someone needed help or that someone had been forgotten. He started to picture her moving through the city at night. He imagined her a small courier slipping through alleyways, threading between strangers' lives, collecting mislaid pieces of human existence. The image comforted him and terrified him in equal measures. Comfort because it meant motion, terror because motion can end badly. There were nights she simply did not come. Those nights stretched out and the absence made a blank ache. He walked the block. He checked the alley. He called. He told himself not to be foolish. He told himself cats are independent creatures. He told himself 100 small aphorisms to patch the dark. None of them settled. One night, after 3 days without anything left at the door, Sam decided he could not keep living on the margin of curiosity. The worry had thickened into something with teeth. He wanted to know where she went. The knowledge felt urgent the way a wound does when you don't know if it's infected. He wanted to follow, to see the path she traced with her small, silent paws. He did not tell the neighbors. He tied on a jacket even though it was warmer than it had any right to be for that hour. He put his phone in his pocket with the screen dim. He left the front light on because habit is an act of faith, and he did not want to come back to a dark house. He stepped out into the thick, humid air that felt like a blanket folded too many times. The city at night has different bones. Traffic is a slow river. Lights flicker like beacons dressed down. The smell of rain rose from the seams in the street, and the world felt less like a document and more like a story. He could hear distant music from an open bar. He could hear footsteps and the lazy hush of tires. He saw, across the span of a lawn, the cat sitting under a street lamp, as if it were a small column in a temple. She looked ordinary and unremarkable. She was not. Sam followed at a distance he told himself was strategic, not cowardly. He kept low, behind parked cars and the generous shadow of oak trees. His breath made small clouds in the air, though the night was not cold. The cat moved with the ease of someone who owned the world in tiny increments. Her pads made almost no sound. Her tail was a metronome that meant, "Here, I go this way." She moved quickly at times, darting like a thought. She paused sometimes to look at something inside a storm drain or in the crook of a porch. She sniffed at a lamppost and then lifted her head and went on like she had been reminded of a task. Sam's heart bumped in his ribcage with each corner she turned. He felt foolish and brave in equal measure. She led him away from their block and through places he barely knew existed, behind the laundromat where machines hummed and a light was always on, past the bakery's cooler door that leaked warm air, by a row of small, careful gardens where someone had placed glass jars like tiny planets. She crossed the park where the swings moved without wind and a homeless man smoked slowly and watched them pass with an expression that contained both amusement and respect. Occasionally she paused near a person and did something small and uncanny. A woman in scrubs sitting on a bench tucked her hands into her lap and looked at the cat as if she had been waiting for a reprieve. She reached into her pocket and produced a small wrapped biscuit. The cat accepted it and blinked at Sam as if to say, "I was not acting out of favor. I am following a route." The woman patted the cat and then touched her face as if thanking it for a kindness she had not yet articulated. Sam felt like an intruder in a private ritual. His forehead was moist with sweat, though it wasn't hot. He felt young and foolish and strangely alive. Wherever she went, there were lives touched, small and unadorned. She seemed to be a courier of small consolations. It soothed him to watch, and also wounded him, because every small kindness she met was a mirror showing him the kindness he had not been giving and the kindness he might still be given. At one point, under the yellow smear of a street lamp, she dropped a sock from her mouth. It was not one of the ordinary socks she had left before. This one had a strip of fabric tied to it, a scrap with a child's name scribbled in a crayon that had run in the rain. Sam recognized the child's sloppy handwriting from a poster he had once seen in a local bookstore, a flyer for a lost cat, an absent birthday party. The name tugged at him like a gust through a seam. "Do you think animals know when we're at our lowest?" he asked the lamppost, because it felt wrong to ask the question anywhere near the cat. He had been asked the question before in a softer voice, and he had not known how to answer. Now the cat looked up at him with a blink that suggested an answer older than his conversation. She did not look like she knew as much as she looked as if she had chosen to do something about it. The cat's logic was not human. She did not offer explanations. She offered presence. She left objects as if they were patches for the people she had visited. Sam realized that presents and objects had a relationship. The things she left were small rituals of remembering. The route changed. She walked him through a faded neighborhood he had only driven past. It smelled of citrus peels and engine oil. She slipped through a narrow opening in a chain-link fence in a courtyard that seemed to exist nowhere on the map. Inside the yard, there were toys abandoned with the reverence of things that had outlived their owners. There was a low brick wall. Someone had sewn a patch onto the wall here, and it read like a small, untranslatable code of mourning. He saw a tiny shrine of plastic toys and candles half burned. The cat paused at the shrine, sniffed the air, then turned and looked at him. Straight, 2 green moons. She gave the slightest chirrup and darted past a mound of old shoes and into the shadowed arch of a basement door that leaned open a few inches. Sam's breath hitched. The basement door was the kind that suggests the private life of a building. It smelled like old dust and wet cardboard. A light inside flickered. He stood rooted. The cat did not look back. She was already inside. He could have called out. He could have returned home and gone to bed and pretended he had never been curious. He did none of those things. He put his hand on the metal edge of the door and felt the cold go through to his palm. Then he went in. It was darker inside than outside. The air was a little cooler. There were steps down, and the cat was just ahead, moving with an import that made him think she belonged to the other side of the world. He followed quietly, holding himself like someone who does not want to alarm a sleeping animal. Every step he took made his chest tight. The basement opened into a courtyard, smaller, and oddly sheltered from the city. It had seen better days. There were boxes stacked against a wall, a rusted tricycle, a collapsed stroller. The cat moved through it like a waterway, stopping at each small pile, checking with a nose, then going on. At the center of the courtyard was a metal tin half buried in a mound of old toys and fabric. The lid was dented. Someone had placed a flat stone on top like a tiny marker. The cat climbed onto the tin and sat with the air of a guardian. Sam drew closer and wiped his hands on his jeans. He reached out and lifted the lid. Inside were socks. Not random socks, neatly folded, clean. Tiny socks, big socks, the variety of small domestic economies. Each sock smelled faintly of someone, a person, a child, a hospital corridor, a playground, a grandmother's house. There was a hospital wristband curled inside the tin, the faded ink of a name hardly legible. There was a small photograph, the kind that people keep in a locket, though this one was the size of a coin and creased from being folded. The photograph showed a young woman smiling on a hospital bed with a shadowed man at her side. The creases of the photo had been softened by time. Sam picked up the photograph. His fingers were careful. He did not know why. The picture had no names. It smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. He traced the face without recognizing it, and then a small sound behind him made him drop the photograph back into the tin. The cat had been more than a courier then. She was a collector. She curated small things in that tin like a museum for the private griefs of a neighborhood. The items had a logic he could almost parse. They were objects given to the cat or taken by her from the places she visited and returned to this courtyard, her archive. A twig snapped outside and a floorboard creaked, the kind of small household sounds that feel enormous at night. A voice called from the far end of the courtyard. It was soft at first and then clearer, male, tired. Marigold? The voice said. Not a name Sam had ever heard, but the voice carried a tonal shape he recognized. It was calling for a familiar presence. The cat froze, ears pricked. She turned and slinked toward the sound like a ribbon pulled taut. Sam felt a hot, sudden ache rise in his throat. Whoever lived here had a name for the cat. The name sounded private and old. He stayed very still. The courtyard had the air of a place that held up the things people could not bear to show in daylight. The tin was a repository not just of objects but of losses and recoveries. Each sock had a story, each wristband a hospital moment, each toy a childhood fragment. The cat had been making this place a communal ledger, carrying remnants in and leaving them in the same place like a deliberate archivist. Sam's brain ran through possibilities and found more questions than answers. Who put the stone on the lid? Who maintained this courtyard? Was it the cat's owner or a collective of people who used the cat as a messenger? Had the cat learned this behavior from being human affectionate, or had she always known where to find what was useful? He wanted to ask the woman with the hospital smile in the tiny photo what it meant. He wanted to ask the neighbors about the tin. He wanted to know why the cat had chosen him. He wanted to know if the tin had anything to do with his wife. He wanted to know if the cotton band with faded ink belonged to someone he knew. The questions piled into his ribs like stones. The voice came again, closer, a whisper of shoes. "Marigold, where are you?" "Don't wander off," someone said, and then a light behind a window clicked on, and footsteps padded. The sound of a key in the distant lock made Sam's head spin a little. He had the sudden, absurd fear of discovery, of being exposed like an eavesdropper in the middle of someone else's tender ritual. The cat hopped down and brushed against his leg, the same quiet, small gesture she had used to anchor him back at the door. She looked up at him with those green moons and gave a soft meow that felt like permission. She then darted toward a narrow passage in the brick wall where a child-sized gate stood. The tin was not the end. It was a waypoint. The cat slipped through the gate and vanished into a shadowed corridor. Sam felt that old, familiar tug of wanting to know the rest. His feet moved before he fully intended them to. He followed. The corridor smelled of dust and old laundry. It opened into another yard, a cluster of tenement-style apartments with windows lit like fish tanks. Someone hung clothes on lines that stitched between balconies. A radio somewhere played a song that made him think of summer. On a low stoop sat an old man in a chair. His face was deeply mapped with a life of sun and work. Beside him sat a teenage girl with headphones undone, her expression half closed as if listening to a memory. A child no older than 7 sat clutching a worn action figure and looked at the cat with a guarded reverence. The cat walked straight to the child and bumped her head against his hand. The child did not say anything. He smiled very small. He picked up a sock from his lap and offered it, as if in exchange, as if the tin were a bank. The cat accepted. They had a transaction. Sam felt his chest unclench slightly. The courtyard was not a hoard of lost things. It was a place where things were given and taken back. It was a market of second chances. He watched the interactions and felt a strange mingling of relief and alienation. It was easy to imagine the cat as a secret saint of the small. It was harder to imagine what it meant for his relationship with the animal. The cat was not his only link to the world now. She was a bridge across many small lives. He had imagined her bedroom at his feet. Instead, she belonged to a neighborhood. Story. He could have left then. He could have walked back into the night and returned to the comfort of his kitchen and the wooden box on the shelf. He could have pretended he had not found the tin, pretended the cat's life extended no further than his doorstep. Instead, he moved closer. He wanted to be part of the ledger. He wanted selfishly to be included. A woman's voice called softly from an upstairs window. "Is she back?" The old man answered, "Always." He did not look at Sam. He was used to strangers. The teenager kicked at the ground and then looked at Sam with a curiosity that was not hostile, more cataloging. Children have a way of seeing the edges of adult pain without getting stuck in it. The boy with the action figure put his hand out, and the cat twined herself into it. He did not notice Sam at first. Then another sound. The scrape of fabric. The echo of a shoe. Someone had come down the back steps. A figure appeared, a woman in a housecoat, hair wrapped in a scarf. She carried a small tin cup and set it on the step. Her eyes went toward the gate and then softened when she saw the cat. She called out, "Maggie," as if naming an old friend. The cat flicked her tail and sat primly on the steps. The woman's voice floated through the courtyard with something like forgiveness in it. "You find things for us, don't you?" she said. Sam felt like an intruder on a kind of holy ground. He wanted to ask, but words felt clumsy and dangerous in a place where people traded in small confidences. Instead, he stepped closer to the tin. He glanced inside again. The wristband peeked out. The photograph lay face down. There was suddenly a sound that made him freeze. A child starting to cry in the distance, a sharp, small thing that was more than sound. It was a reason to stop. The woman in the housecoat stood and walked toward the child with a speed that startled Sam. She called, "It's okay, baby," in a voice that smoothed the edges of the cry. Sam felt like he had stumbled into an act of repair. He did not know whether he deserved to be there. The people around him had grocery lists and medical appointments and lost teeth and small, ordinary tragedies. They had found a way to use a cat to pass comfort between them. The cat performed, in the plainest terms, as an emissary of attention. It was then that the shift happened. Up until that moment, the cat had been steady. She held a pattern, she was consistent. But as the woman soothed the child, the cat stood and lifted a sock from the tin with her teeth. She did not leave it on the ground. She carried it down to the corner of the courtyard and deposited it at the base of a mailbox. She then sat back and looked at the metal box. Her head was tilted at an angle that made Sam think she understood something he did not. He watched, and a small suspicion crawled into his mind. Maybe the objects were not random at all. Maybe they were coordinates. Maybe they were a language of placement that connected people, not in a central archive, but in a map of small rituals. She placed socks at certain landmarks. She left ribbons on stoops, buttons under stoop stones. The tin held a repository, but she also distributed. She was not just collecting. She was making. Sam could feel the thread of something larger being pulled taut under the small intersections of the courtyard, the sock at the mailbox, the ribbon on the stoop, a wristband under a drain. The pattern was less a haphazard hoarding and more an act of connecting, of building a lattice of touchpoints for people who needed signals. He felt awe in his chest. He also felt something sharp and anxious. The pattern of distribution meant she moved through risk. She went to places where children played and where dogs barked and where cars might take a turn too fast. She moved through spaces where harm could touch her. He cared for her in a way that felt like a responsibility and also like a debt. That night, as the courtyard began to shrink back into its shadows and the neighbors returned to their rooms, the woman in the housecoat locked the gate and called, "Good night, Marigold." The cat responded with a chirrup and brushed against Sam's ankle as if to say, "Tonight we end the ledger clean." Sam stood up too quickly and felt the sudden vertigo of a man who had been on the edge of something private and had overstepped. He made his way toward the exit, the tin in his mind like a warm stone. At the gate, he hesitated. The woman looked at him and nodded. "We watch after her," she said. "She watches after us." There was a quiet in her tone that implied long hours and a long practice of mutual keeping. Sam wanted to ask if he could be part of their circle. He wanted to tell them about the socks at his door. He wanted to claim the cat and be reassured he was not just another nighttime voyeur. He left without saying more than thank you. Outside, the city air felt louder. The lamplight turned the pavement into a river of molten gold. He walked home with his hands empty and his head full. The cat followed him as if she were making sure a loose thread did not snag. She slipped under his door and into the dim light of his hallway and left, on the mat, a small damp scrap of paper that had something written on it in hurried handwriting. He bent to pick it up and read the single word that made his throat close. It was a name. Not his wife's, not his son's, but a name that suggested a story he had not yet been told. The ink was smudged, as if someone had cried when they had written it. The paper smelled faintly of coffee and smoke. He stood there, a long time, the word repeating itself in his head like a drum. He did not sleep that night. He sat in the kitchen with a mug and the scrap of paper and the wooden box on the shelf like an altar. The cat settled there on the rim of the chair and watched him with steady eyes. The pattern felt more complicated. The cat's route was not random. She threaded between a network of small pains and small solaces. She was a courier in a city of small remediations. Then, the change. She stopped bringing things to his door, not suddenly. It was a slow unthreading. At first he thought he had imagined it. One night there was nothing. Then two. He refused to panic. He told himself cats have moods. He told himself it was a new route, a new circuit. He started to check the tin in the courtyard by the hole in the chain-link fence, but the neighborhood clock told him the tin was sometimes buried and sometimes out in the open. The inconsistency made his stomach coil. By the 6th night of nothing, he began to feel a hollow sort of alarm. He walked the route she used to take. He found the mailbox where she had once left a sock and the stoop where she had placed a ribbon. The places were unchanged. The tin lay open and unmolested. The courtyard looked like a stage set that had been emptied. He walked back home under the yawning sky and felt the damp on his hands. The cat returned, finally, on the 7th night. But she did not come with a sock. She came without a thing in her mouth. She came in late and she came slow. She had a limp in her step, a little hitch that tugged at one paw. When she sat at the threshold, she looked up at him, and for the first time since he had known her, she did not purr when he reached to touch her. Her chest heaved faintly. Her gaze seemed to hold a message too heavy to be left at the door. Sam knelt. He put his hand over her spine and felt something like heat and exhaustion. He saw a faint dark line near her paw. Dried blood? A stain. He did not know. His breath hitched. She followed him to the kitchen then, not into the night with her quiet secrets, but inside, into the small hospital of the house. Sam lit a lamp and set a bowl of water and some dry food he had bought on impulse. She drank slowly, head down, careful as if the act of drinking might be a test. He sat beside her and tried to read the small map of her body for some clue as to what had happened. She closed her eyes and leaned into his hand. A small, brave surrender. That night, he called the number of the woman from upstairs. He left a message. Is she okay? He did not know what else to say. He closed the phone and sat with the cat at his feet and thought about the tin and the courtyard and the faces he had seen. He thought about the wristband and the shrines and the photograph and how all of it threaded through a city that had once felt like a disorder of small, lonely boxes and now felt like a mesh. At some point in the gray of the morning, he dozed and dreamed of the courtyard full of tin, his wife standing in the doorway that smelled of lemon cleaner, the cat bringing a sock that had been stitched by a careful hand. He woke with the image in his head and a small sudden terror lodged in his throat. He checked the door. The night had left a ring of frost on the sill. The cat was gone. The small stain on her paw had darkened. He made tea and stared at the wooden box like an oracle. The neighborhood was waking. A delivery truck sighed down the street. A child's laughter passed like a bell. He set out again. He told himself he didn't need permission to go to the courtyard. He had been there before. He slipped through the chain-link hole and walked across the bricks like someone tracing an old line. The tin was empty. The stone that had served as a lid marker had been moved. Someone had left a fresh sock at the base of the mailbox. The sock had a single word tied with a small ribbon. He did not recognize the handwriting. The word was the same one as the paper the cat had left on his mat the night before. It felt like an invitation or a warning. He was not sure which. He checked the edges of the courtyard for footprints. He found a small trail of paw prints that stopped at the corner where the gate narrowed. They headed out toward a side street that opened onto an alley and a heavy black door he had always thought led to a storage unit. There was nobody on the street. The city seemed to be holding its breath. He felt his chest tighten. He wanted to turn back. He wanted to tell himself that the cat was a creature of whim and that this was a whim going wrong. He also wanted, with the depth of someone who cannot erase a habit, to know where she had gone and why she had stopped leaving socks at his door. He moved toward the black door. It had a peephole and a small brass plate where the number had been. Worn off by decades of hands, the alley smelled of fried onions and something sweet. He pressed his ear to the door and thought, as most of us do when we stand outside someone else's life at night, that what happens beyond those walls is private, that he was a trespasser. He also thought that not knowing was a kind of violence he no longer wanted to tolerate. He put his hand on the cold metal handle. Inside the room, a radio played softly. There was the low murmur of voices. He heard laughter, then a quieter sound, like someone whispering a name, softly, again and again. The sound made his throat thicken. He laid his hand on the knob and felt the texture of the metal, and for the first time since he had begun following the cat's circuit, he placed himself at the threshold of something he could not translate. A light switched on inside. The door cracked open a fraction, a hand pushed it wider, and the person on the other side, tired, misreading his face, expecting a peddler and finding a man in a jacket, looked at him with a question in his eyes. Before Sam could speak, before he could explain why he had followed the cat into the tangle of neighborhood courtyards, before he could say the word that had been written on the scrap of paper, the cat climbed up the man's chest and sat there, like she belonged to the room, like she had been its reason. She jumped down and trotted across the floor to the man. She rubbed her cheek along his hand and then turned and looked directly at Sam, with an intensity that felt like a rope pulling him in. The man followed the direction of her gaze. His expression shifted. He leaned over and reached under a table and produced a small dented tin. He lifted the lid and showed the socks and the wristband and the photograph. "Been keeping them safe," he said, voice flat but soft. "She brings what folks forget to ask for. Keeps it until it's time." Sam opened his mouth. Everything in him wanted to ask where the name on the scrap of paper had come from, who the woman in the hospital photo had been, which small life had been tethered to the wristband. He wanted to know why the cat had stopped, coming to his door, and instead had been leaving objects like a trail of breadcrumbs that led to this room, this tin, this assembly of small salvations. But even as questions stacked up, a sound from the street cut through. The yelp of a bicycle. Chain, like metal on metal, and then the rapid thud of someone running. The man's eyes darted toward the door. The cat stiffened, ears pricked. The radio crackled and then fell silent. At the doorway, someone called out in a voice that broke slightly, "Hey, you! What are you doing back here?" Sam turned toward the voice. The cat stared at him with the steady, clean gaze of something that had been keeping more than socks. The man in the doorway reached a hand toward him, but it was not clear whether the hand was a welcome or a restraining gesture. Everything tightened. The tin sat open on the floor like a confession. The name on the paper pulsed in Sam's head. The cat, his cat in a sense he had been granting himself, sat between them, a small, unblinking mediator. The courtyard seemed to tilt a degree. Sam's breath caught. He had arrived at a junction he had not known existed. The cat's routine had changed. It had moved from offering tokens at his door to weaving a network of exchange, of memory, of tasks he had not been part of. He had followed her to the edge of someone else's life, and now, in the hush, with the man at the door and a voice calling from the street, he realized he had stepped past the last line of safety. The cat looked at him again, and in her gaze was a promise and a question. She had led him here for a reason. He did not yet know whether that reason was a gift or a warning. He felt both. The voice at the street took another step closer. The man at the doorway cleared his throat and said quietly, "Do you know that name?" Sam opened his mouth to answer. The cat meowed, and the sound seemed to fold the room in half. Outside, the city waited. Inside, the tin glittered with small, patient things. Sam's hand trembled on the edge of decision. And then the cat rose, as if calling the moment to its appointed place, and walked directly toward him, tail held like a flag, and laid a single sock at his feet, the cuff turned outward, the fabric warm. He bent to pick it up. The voice outside the alley had drawn nearer. A shadow moved in the doorway. The sock in his hand felt heavier than it had any right to. The cat sat back on her haunches and fixed him with her moonlight eyes. Something had changed in her routine. Something was about to be asked of him. He could feel the pull of it like a tide. He looked up at the man in the doorway, at the woman's hand that had shown him the tin, at the boy with the action figure, at the old man in his chair, and then toward the open alley where the voice lingered like a promise. The alley breathed. The cat found his knee, and the room condensed to the weight of a single question. He was ready, and he was not. The cat lay her head against his palm and did not move. The footsteps stopped outside. The voice said, sharper now. Who are you? The door opened a little wider. Light spilled into the alley like a careless hand. The man who stood in the threshold was younger than Sam had expected, but his face had a kind of guarded softness that comes from looking after other people's small calamities. He wore a paint-streaked sweatshirt and a name tag that read Mateo. He blinked at Sam as if surprised to see anyone outside a neighborhood door at that hour. The cat, Marigold they called her, sat between Sam's feet and looked up at the man with a stare so steady it felt like a question and an answer at once. Mateo's eyes moved from the cat to the open tin. He did not seem angry. He did not seem alarmed. He seemed at once both exhausted and relieved. He lifted the tin and set it on the floor with a soft clink. You shouldn't be here, he said, but there was no bite to it. The words landed like a tired note in the air. Sam felt the scrape of his own breath. I followed her, he said. He could not make the sentence less strange. It sounded like a confession of theft. It sounded like something else. The cat nudged his hand with the heel of her head, as if to steady him. Mateo watched him for a long moment. He did not laugh. He did not reprimand. He gestured with the shadow of his hand toward a chair by the wall and said, Sit. The invitation was simple. Sam obeyed. Inside the room, the smell was a careful collage. Lemon cleaner, old coffee, the faint iron tang of time. The radio was off now. Strings of low light hung from the ceiling like the backstage lights at a small theater. On the table, near the tin, there were cups, a stack of worn magazines, a calendar with dates circled in red. It felt like a room that had seen many nights of people arriving and leaving and then returning to arrange the world again. Mateo sat across from him. He folded his hands. The cat hopped up onto a low shelf and watched like a judge who had been on the bench long enough to know the law, but not so long that she had forgotten mercy. You followed her, Mateo said again. There was a softness there now, but under it a question. He looked at Sam as if he were gauging whether Sam could carry what he was about to tell him. Sam tried to explain. The sentence found its own way out. She stopped leaving. Things at my door. I wanted to know why. Mateo nodded as if the answer made sense. She's been busy, he said, and in that small phrase the room expanded. She's been busier than usual. Busy how? Sam asked. The question felt ridiculous in the hush of the room. It felt necessary. Mateo leaned forward like he had been waiting to make a quiet announcement. This place is where she keeps what she finds, he said, indicating the tin. We call it the ledger. People bring things here sometimes. Sometimes she brings them herself. We keep them until someone remembers them, or until it feels right. Sam's hand shook near the edge of the tin. He wanted to look inside and not look inside at the same time. He thought of the photograph he had seen. He thought of the wristband. He thought of the scrap of paper with the name he could not forget. There was a pressure in his chest like a fist. Who's we? He asked. Mateo smiled in the way people smile when they are listing a long, secret roll call. Neighbors, a few volunteers, an old woman who lives up the stairs, a teenager who fixes bikes, an out-of-work nurse. We all keep an eye. It started because of Elena. The name landed in Sam like a bell you had not been ready to hear. Elena. It was his wife's name. It startled him so much he felt his mouth go dry. He hadn't spoken her name aloud in weeks. The sound of it made a small fracture run across the surface of his calm. Mateo's voice softened. She used to sit here, he said. She'd sit with a mug and a notebook and watch Marigold. Elena liked to write. She liked to write small lists. She'd leave things here sometimes, and then she'd ask the cat to take them back if she thought someone might need them. When she was in the hospital, the cat didn't know how to stay. She kept bringing things back, and we started to collect them. It felt like the right thing to do. Sam's vision narrowed to the table and the tin, and then widened in a single dizzying rush. He reached out a hand toward the tin and then pulled back. The room seemed to tilt. He remembered the hospital scent. He remembered the lemon cleaner. He remembered Elena's hands, how she used to tuck a stray hair behind her ear, the small way she smoothed her skirt when she was thinking. Did she... Sam's voice broke. Did Elena put things in here? Mateo nodded. She used to write names in little notes and tuck them in socks she couldn't return. She called them placeholders. She said if she couldn't fix a thing, at least she could note that someone else had it. It started small. She would tie a ribbon to a lamppost, and that would be enough for someone to find it later. People saw that and started to leave things, here on purpose. Sam felt the floor move beneath him with the force of a memory he had kept folded too tight. He remembered Elena at a windowsill, a pen in her fingers, her mouth pursed. He remembered the day he had taken her to the hospital and the way the curtain swung shut like the final syllable of a word. He had never known she had started something like this. He had not known she had left the world a map of small favors. He started again. He didn't know how to finish. Mateo put a hand on the tin. His thumb rubbed the dent on the lid. She found that people lost pieces of themselves out in the city. Socks, buttons, small things that were more than they seemed. She wanted someone to have them back when they were ready. The cat helped because the cat could slip everywhere. Marigold got used to being a courier. She learned where grief lived and where it needed a nudge. Sam's throat ached in so many places he could not place the points of pain. He felt like an intruder at his own memorial. The idea that Elena had been here, writing notes, tying ribbons, was a kind of ghost that moved through the room and set things into motion. And the photograph? Sam asked. The one in the tin, the wristband. Mateo opened the tin and handed Sam the photograph with gentle fingers. This time, Sam did not hesitate. He let it rest in his palms. The paper was warm from where it had lain in someone's pocket. He turned it gently. The picture showed Elena smiling, smaller than life, and at the same time utterly present. A hospital band at her wrist, Mateo himself standing at her shoulder in the background. Sam felt the photograph like a hand against his chest. Elena and Mateo, a voice said. It was quiet. Sam looked up. The woman in the housecoat he had seen in the courtyard stood in the corner now. Her face was lined with kindness. She had watched all of this like someone who knew the choreography of pain and comfort. She kept asking us to look after her things, she said. She kept telling us the cat would do the work. She was right. She smiled then, and it was the faintest thing, like the edge of a photograph. Sam felt something crack. It was not a terrible sound. It was an almost inaudible thing, the release of a pressure valve inside his chest. He did not know whether he should laugh or cry, so he did both. Tears came in a rush that tasted of iron and lemon. He covered his mouth with his hand and let them fall. Mateo reached across and placed his palms over Sam's clasped hands. His touch was solid and human, and it steadied him. She wanted people to be kept, Mateo said. Not because she was grand, but because she understood the small currency of things. A sock can be a story. A button can be a name. A ribbon can say, "You are not alone." Sam felt each word like a stitch. He thought about the socks at his door. He thought of the astronaut sock and the ragged one with the hole. He thought about the shoelace and the moth. He thought of the wristband and the photograph and the small paper with the name that had haunted him for nights. He thought about how grief had made him a person who tended to lists and how Elena had used the same small acts to stitch a neighborhood to itself. Why did she stop leaving things here? Sam asked. It was not a sharp question. It was a man, reaching for a place to stand. Mateo exhaled a little. When she was sicker, she wanted to make sure things would keep going. She asked us to. She tied the tin to the metal post and we agreed to watch. Then she passed. The cat kept going. She kept the practice alive. It became like a service. People would bring things here if they had nowhere else to put them. Sometimes the items were things they couldn't bear to hold in their own rooms, so they left them to be returned in small ways or kept until a person was ready. Sam's hands had stopped trembling and then started again. He reached into the tin with a clumsy reverence and pulled out something he had not been prepared for. It was a scarf. Not just any scarf. The texture, the faint floral print, the frayed edge. He knew it at once. It was Elena's scarf, the one she wore in winter that smelled faintly of lemon and gardenias. He lifted it up. For a second, the room tilted. The air seemed to hold its breath. He pressed the scarf to his face and inhaled. The scent was like a tide. It pulled tears out of him and left him empty and full at once. He fell backward into the chair as if the ground had been pulled from beneath him, and Mateo and the woman watched him with a patience that felt like a hand at his shoulder. He could not speak. The scarf in his hands felt like an accusation and a gift. It was proof that Elena had not simply vanished. She had been doing work while she was still here, small, stubborn acts that glowed with tenderness. It was proof that he had not been the only person who loved her enough to keep her rituals alive. He pressed the scarf to his chest and let himself make a sound that was more animal than speech. He had been living in a kind of dry winter. This felt like a thaw. It did not cure him. It did not erase what had happened. But it rearranged the collapse of his days into something with texture again. The cat jumped down from the shelf and came to his lap without ceremony. She curled into him like a small warm stone. Her weight was a fact he could hold. He felt the rise and fall of her breathing under his hands. He felt the tiny tremble of her purr, a slow, stuttering engine. In the hush, Mateo explained some more. She started mapping things that were lost, he said. Not just objects, parts of days. If someone left a slipper at the park or a button fell off a cardigan in a bus, Marigold would take note. She'd hold it until someone mentioned it. Then she'd leave it where that person would find it. It was like she knew where to stitch. The gaps. Sam thought of the times the cat had dropped socks at his door. He thought of the way the objects had been placed with deliberate orientation. Openings facing outward, ribbons neatly laid, buttons stacked. He remembered the shoelace and the way the cat had let it fall at a mailbox. He had not seen the method in the madness. He had seen the quiet work of connection. "Why did she stop bringing things to me?" he asked, voice small. Mateo shrugged, an expression that suggested 1,000 small possibilities. Maybe she thought you were part of the map now, and she wanted to show you the rest. Maybe she thought you needed to know the ledger. She's been shifting the routes lately. Old cats do that when we ask more of them. Or maybe she was trying to bring you into the circle. Sam felt that last sentence like an answer shaped in the same way a hand shapes clay. He had wanted to be included. He had followed her like a man following a thread through a labyrinth. Here, in the dim light, he understood the circle had been there all along. He had been a part of it without knowing. The house that had felt like a museum was now revealed to him as a node in a quietly busy network of care. Mateo leaned back and rubbed his face with the heel of his hand. "We have rules," he said. "Take things only if they're meant for you. If you find something that could be someone else's, return it to the tin. We watch out for Marigold. We watch out for each other. She knows that. She trusts us because we keep our end of it." Sam listened and felt the small pieces of his life slide into a new arrangement. He thought of the socks stacked in his wooden box. He thought of the astronaut sock and the hospital wristband. He thought about how small ecosystems of care could exist in plain sight if only someone noticed the pattern. At one point, he looked down and realized he had a sock in his hand. He had not remembered taking it. It was the same sock Marigold had, left at his feet when he had followed her to the door. He had bent to pick it up and then been pulled into this story. The sock felt like a mediator, a thing whose sole purpose was to be held and then to do its work of connecting. He put the sock back gently into the tin. It seemed the right place for it now. He placed it beside the scarf. The motion felt like folding a map. They talked for a long time after that. Mateo told stories of the neighborhood, of the old man who had once lost a wedding band and had wept when the cat placed it back on his doorstep, of the teenager who had found a note she had written years before and read it aloud by the window until she laughed and cried at once. The room filled with small narratives. None of them were grand. None of them solved anything. But each one braided into the next like threads on a loom. At one point, Sam asked quietly, "Have you ever had an animal wait for you, even when you didn't ask them to?" The question fell soft between them. It was a small echo of the question. He had asked the cat nights before, but now it had a different timbre, less a query and more a confirmation. Mateo smiled, and the woman in the housecoat nodded. All the time, Mateo said. They do. They come around because there is need. They know the shape of sorrow. They know what happens when we stop talking. Animals step in with what they have. It's not mystical. It's practical. It's presence. Sam watched the cat press her head into his palm. It was the same gesture he had felt on the doormat the first night. It was simple. It was perfect. He felt something in his chest align. A map he'd been holding folded one way finally, opened. Why did she do it? Sam asked. Why socks? Why buttons? Why this particular kind of map? Mateo's face softened. Because these small things are often what people lose when their lives turn upside down. A sock is small enough to be forgotten at a hospital, but it carries with it the scent of home. A button speaks of a sweater someone loved. A wristband is proof someone was touched by care. Elena noticed that. She thought these things deserved a place to wait until their owners were ready to find them. The cat, she's efficient. She remembers. She understands roots because she's a cat. She moves through neighborhoods like water. Sam stared down at the scarf now in his lap and felt the weave of Elena's habit like a lace. He understood, with a clarity that made his limbs tremble, why the cat had been leaving him socks. They were invitations. They were a language. The cat had been trying to teach him a grammar of small recoveries. She had not been just giving him objects. She had been giving him trust. She had been offering him a way back into the map Elena had started. He thought of how he had been living in his house like a person who had forgotten the password to their own life. The cat and the tin had given him a way back. The knowledge felt like sun on winter soil. Mateo reached into a drawer and pulled out a small notebook. He fanned it open. The pages were filled with names, dates, little sketches, an index of the ledger. We keep records, he said, so nothing gets lost. If someone comes looking, we try to track it down. Sometimes the person who needs the object is right there in the courtyard, and sometimes they don't know the thing belongs to them until it is returned. Sam flipped through the pages. He found the name he had seen on the scrap. It was there, written in Mateo's tidy, exaggerated letters. He traced it with a fingertip. Underneath was a short note. It read, simply, found, waiting. His chest tightened. The handwriting was not Elena's. It was someone else's. But the message felt like a relay. The woman in the housecoat suggested gently that they could call the number he had left on his message. We'll let you know more, she said. If you want to help, you can come by tomorrow. We could use another pair of hands. Sam thought of his kitchen table, the wooden box on the shelf, the small rituals he had been managing alone. He thought of Elena's scarf on his lap. He felt like a man who had been invited back into a world he had been turned out of. The invitation was small. It was precisely what he needed. He nodded. The motion felt like stepping into the water and finding it warm. Outside, the alley held the sound of a car passing, the soft hum of a city that kept going. Inside the room, the tin glittered with the ordinary artifacts of many lives. The cat sat in his lap and looked up at him with an expression he had already started to understand. She pressed her head into his palm again. The gesture meant so much. It was a trust to be accepted. It was an assignment disguised as affection. He felt the first full breath he had taken in months. It was not the end of anything. The house would still be full of empty chairs and half-finished to-do lists. The boy's bedroom would still be a space he could not yet reorder. But somewhere, a small network had named him again. Not in any grand way. In the way neighbors name one another by coming to the window in the rain, in the way people leave a light on. He leaned forward and wiped his face. His hands were steady enough to fold the scarf and place it into a small pouch Mateo handed him. Keep it close, Mateo said. Sometimes having a piece of someone in your pocket is the exact kind of medicine you need, and if you want to bring things to the ledger, bring them. If you think something's yours, tell us. If you want to, help watch for her, we'd like that too. Sam did not know what to say, so he said the simple truth. Thank you. Mateo nodded. The woman at the window smiled with a tenderness that had the shape of a prayer. The boy with the action figure kicked his feet and then, with a small, brave smile, offered Sam a paper airplane. Sam took it and folded it back to its original neatness, as if it were a relic. Marigold purred. Her body warmed his lap like a tiny hearth. She looked like a cat who had always known her job. She looked like a cat who had chosen him on purpose. She looked like a cat who had been, quietly, teaching him the way back to the world. Sam left the room later with the scarf in a pouch, a promise to return, and a head full of names and small stories. He walked home under a sky that had begun to lighten. The city welcomed him with the same indifferent grace as before, but he felt different. He felt included in something that had the scale of a neighborhood and the intimacy of a kitchen table. That night, the cat came to the door as she always did. She dropped a small, neat sock on the mat. It was placed with its opening facing the street. Sam bent and picked it up, and rather than placing it in his own wooden box, he took it directly to the tin in the courtyard and set it down with a careful hand. The motion was precise, and it felt like arriving. When he returned to his kitchen, the scarf heavy in his pocket, Marigold leapt onto a chair and looked at him as if to say, "You did the right thing." He sat and placed his palm on the back of her neck. She pressed her forehead into his palm and then gave a long, low purr. In that sound was an assurance as old and as simple as breathing. He understood in a way that left him weak and also remarkably steady. The cat had not been a healer in the miraculous sense. She had been a keeper. She had been a network node. She had been a practice of attention handed down from the woman he had loved and kept alive by neighbors who had the courage of small mercies. The objects were not simply things. They were invitations. They were signals. You are seen, you are held, you are part of this. Sam stayed up that night with the window open and the scarf by his side. He thought about Elena and about how the work she had started continued in the quietest, most tenacious ways. He thought about Mateo and the woman in the housecoat, and the boy with the action figure, and the old man in his chair. He thought about the cat whose name meant flower, and who had the efficiency of a small bureaucracy of kindness. He slept not because all the heavy things had been resolved, but because he had been given a map. The cat had led him to the ledger, and the ledger had given him back his life in pieces. He knew with a cold and clear certainty that this was not the end of the story. It was, rather, a new chapter in which his life would be threaded through. Other lives with the soft, stubborn hooks of small things, a sock, a button, a worn photograph, a scarf that smelled of lemon in the garden she had once tended. The cat curled up at the foot of the bed. She was the same creature who had dragged socks along the floor and waited at the door. But she was also more. She was a teacher. She was a messenger. She was a keeper of a ledger of lives. Sam reached down and placed his hand on her. She nudged him with her head and looked directly into his face with an intensity that felt like a command. He read the message as clearly as he might. Read any sign. Keep watch. Keep giving. Stay part of the map. He let himself understand then, fully and finally, the cat had not been rescuing socks to mend the fabric of his life. She had been inviting him back into the fabric of the neighborhood. She had been asking him to be not merely a man who endured loss, but a man who participated in the small, continuing work of care. He breathed in. The night was full of small sounds, the distant tumble of a trash truck, a dog's bark, the slow turning of a page somewhere in an open window. He had no illusions that grief was finished. He did not expect to be healed. But the ledger, the cat, Elena's scarves, Mateo's tin, these had given him a practice, a place to begin. Marigold pressed her head into his palm one last time before sleep took him. Her purr vibrated through his hand like a small engine. He returned the pressure, letting his fingers make a slow circle. In that pressure, he felt the world tilt toward something kinder. He closed his eyes. He understood. He kept returning to the courtyard. It became a rhythm. Not quite daily, but often enough to become a kind of appointment. An appointment he kept now, with other people who kept it too. The ledger was not a shrine. It wasn't museum quiet, it was living, noisy in the small ways people are noisy when they tend one another. The tin sat where it always had, dented and bright. The stone marker rested on the lid like a punctuation. Neighbors came and went. They sat on crates and chain-linked chairs and passed warm mugs. They traded stories the way sailors trade knots, short, practical, necessary. Sam brought a sock the first week he volunteered. He had not known whether it belonged in his wooden box or in the tin. He had felt the weight of it in his pocket all day, absurd and real at once. When he stepped into the courtyard, he felt an odd kindness in having been allowed to carry it there. He placed it on the rim of the tin the way one places a coin on a closed palm. Someone who had been watching smiled and slid a paper tag over it, careful as a librarian. The tag read simply, "Found, for the kid who loves rockets." Small handwriting. Neat. Sam did not know who the kid was, and for the first time in months he did not want to know immediately. He wanted the minute to last. Days folded into weeks. That smelled like laundry and lemon cleaner and frying onions from Mrs. Patel's kitchen. He learned the names of the people in the courtyard. Mateo was patient with a kind of quiet humor. The woman in the housecoat, Rosa, walked like someone who had been practicing mercy since she was young. The teenager who fixed bikes, Luis, had grease under his nails and a laugh that could stop a small pity. The old man, Mr. Cautry, sat in his chair and offered the best kind of witnessing, the kind that doesn't demand answers. They had rules and they had songs. The rules were simple. Keep the ledger. Return what's marked. Watch Marigold. The songs were smaller. An old cricket joke, a shared recipe, a list of who would check the tin during holidays. Practical things. Human things. At first, Sam's participation was tentative. He stood at the edges and listened to stories that felt like soft confessions. Someone returned a single mitten to an old lady who had been missing it for years. Someone else wept when a locket was placed on the doorstep and recognized it as the one lost the day his wife had left for the hospital. On sunny afternoons, children ran through the courtyard like commas in longer sentences. The action figure boy began to include Sam in his paper plane economy. Sam learned to fold the planes the boy taught him. He learned to laugh in the exact places the children did. It felt like a small miracle. Marigold settled into the map the way a river settles into a bed. She still came to Sam's door. She still dragged socks with deliberate slowness over the hardwood that first night he met her. But now she also returned with a different cadence. Sometimes she left a sock at his feet because she wanted him to come to the tin. Other times she simply sat with him and refused to move. Her trust had been the opening line. Now she was a steady paragraph. One morning, late autumn, the sky low and the air sharp, Rosa asked Sam if he could help run a route. "We go to the clinic," she said. "There's a bench by the pediatric unit. Folks forget things in the waiting room. Marigold knows." Sam agreed without finesse. He had the kind of need that makes one quick to volunteer. He wanted to be useful. He wanted the soft, precise satisfaction of a small task completed. They walked together through the city with Marigold weaving between their feet like a seamstress's thread. The clinic smelled of coffee and disinfectant. A nurse waved when Marigold paused on her way through the automatic doors. "She's our little ghost," the nurse said. "She finds things people miss." They found a child's cap behind a row of chairs. They found a tiny shoe under a bench. They found a pack of stickers in a trash can, smudged but still bright as morning. They left them on the bench with notes. They titled each note, "Held Here. Ask the ledger." It felt ceremonial and oddly right. It took a few weeks before Sam realized the ledger had reached farther than the courtyard. Elena's practice, her idea that small things could hold memory until someone was ready, had threaded into a neighborhood system. There were tags at bus stops. There were small taped envelopes hidden under park benches. There were ribbons tied in specific knots that signaled, "Leave this, someone will look later." It was folk work, the kind that happens when neighbors make an agreement without meetings or permits. It was exquisitely human. One dusk, After he had closed the tin and Jonas the teenager had pocketed a small iron toy truck to return to a boy 2 streets over, Sam sat on the stoop and watched. He held Elena's scarf folded in his hands. The fabric rested warm in the evening and smelled of lemon and gardenias, and it was both a wound and a comfort. He could feel the warp of the weave and the echo of her fingers, the way she had once smoothed it across her throat. When the boy with the action figure offered him a stick of gum and asked if he wanted to play paper planes, Sam almost cried from relief. Instead, he took the gum and folded another plane, clumsy and awkward and exactly human. The ledger did practical things to grief. It made the world porous in a good way. It allowed losses to move and exchange hands. It would not bring Elena back. It would not mend everything, but it rewired the space between people into a circuit that moved small warmth. Sam learned to place things not out of charity, but as a way to keep connections living. He placed a button in the tin one evening. It was a plain beige button he had found beneath his sofa. He had no idea whose it was. When he reached into the tin the next day, a small note had been tied to the button. "For my grandmother's cardigan, thank you." It was enough. Then came the packet. Marigold had changed the pattern 2 nights before. She had dragged something different and laid it with a care Sam could feel even while he read the label. It was wrapped in brown paper and bound with twine. A small, neat tag was taped across the seam. The tag read, "For Sam. Read when the ledger is open." He had not expected a name. The script was familiar in a way that made his pulse push against his ribs. He waited until Mateo unlocked the tin and tipped the lid back. The courtyard smelled like damp bricks and lemon and the bright dust of the city. Neighbors had gathered, as neighbors do, to watch the ritual of an open tin. The boy with the action figure hovered like an eager apprentice. Luis the bike kid leaned on his wheel like a tree. Mr. Cautry nodded with the solemnity of someone who had seen life return to towns before. Rosa set a kettle on a low burner and poured tea. Sam took the packet into his hands. The twine felt thin under his fingers. He untied it slowly. Paper crackled. Inside was a folded letter and a small scrap of photograph. His hands trembled without his permission. He saw the photograph first. It was a candid. Elena at a park, hair tied up, laughing at something off camera. A sunburst of memory softened the edges of the snap. He could hear suddenly and vividly the sound of her laugh like 2 notes of a song he had once hummed. He opened the letter with fingers that listened. The paper smelled like lemon. The handwriting belonged to Elena. It was small, careful, as if she had written half of it on a commute, half in a hospital bed. He read, "Sam, if you are holding this, then you have come to the ledger. If you have come, then you are allowing the small work in. I know you will be scared. I know you will think you must keep everything folded in a certain way to protect us both from loss. That is a fine and understandable habit. But I want you to know this. We were never meant to hold everything alone. Part of loving each other is letting other people keep the small things until we can. If you are reading this, let the ledger teach you how to be kept and how to keep. Do not be afraid to be held by neighbors and screws and tin lids. You were always part of a map. You just needed to see the lines. If I could be there, I would tell you stories about Marigold's first sock. I would tell you about the coin the old man found in a loaf of bread. I would tell you, God, I would tell you everything. But I left a map instead. It is not a map that replaces me. It is the map that shows you how to go on. Bring the kid's cap from the clinic. Tie a ribbon where someone will find it. Make a small list. Live in minutes, not in enormous laws. I love you, more than the spaces between. E. He read it again, then again. The words were not medicine. They were an invitation. They were a permission. Slip stamped in the ink she had always used to be practical and kind. He felt his throat give way as if a dam had been knocked loose. But what came through that break was not only the old burning hurt. It was a small, fierce gift. Direction. The tin hummed with the soft energy of other people's breaths. Someone passed a mug. Someone coughed a laugh. Mateo said nothing and let Sam be held by the community's silence, the way a leader hands a torch without speech. When Sam looked up, He saw Luis watching him like a person might watch the unwrapping of a new kind of courage. "Will you keep helping?" Luis asked, quicker than an adult ought to. Sam nodded. He did not say yes right away. He nodded because the motion felt honest. It felt like a small bone able to bear weight again. The letter had more than permission. Folded with the page in a small envelope was a list. It was a list of places, not a map in the traditional sense. It was Elena's list of small acts. Bus stop 14, behind bench, blue ribbon. Clinic bench, taped envelope, held for the tired mother, lamppost by the bakery button, tin, check weekly, for Sam. Remember to feed Marigold at night if I'm not there. He laughed then, a short, disbelieving sound. It exploded out of him like light from a slit. He felt ridiculous and grateful. He felt the strange, delicious ache of someone being entrusted with things that mattered. He felt his name not as a lonely island, but as a point on a lattice. The courtyard knew how to hold the moment. They did not demand a speech. They gave him tea in the smallest of ceremonials, a paper plane folded and flown straight into his palm by the action figure boy. "Welcome," the boy said. "You're part of it now." Sam accepted the plane like a cross. From that afternoon forward, Elena's list became a manual of sorts. Sam followed the stained ribbon marks next to the bakery and placed a small handwritten note under a bench in the park. He visited the pediatric clinic and left a sewn little pouch of stickers on the seat with Mateo's neat tag. He learned how to fold a scrap into a flag and tie it to a lamppost so someone would find it who didn't yet know they needed what was waiting. He followed the circuit of small deeds like a pilgrim who had been handed the path. He learned that doing small things for others stitches the fabric you sleep under at night. In time, he found a paper tucked beneath the washing machine in the laundromat. A child had written a name and a drawing. He returned it to the tin as if returning a piece of the lost to its proper ledger. The boy who had lost the paper came by and sat with Sam on the stoop. He told Sam about rockets and how he thought his mother would like that drawing. Sam listened like a man learning to hold more than one kind of grief. He learned to nod at small tragedies and reply with small solutions. The more he gave, the less the house felt like a museum. The more he showed up, the less the silence felt like a wall. Neighbors began to leave things for each other in small, trusting ways. A young couple left a dozen cookies in a tin with a note. "Take one if you're tired." Rosa sewed up a cardigan and left it at the bench with a tag. "For the woman who likes green." One winter evening, someone left a plastic dinosaur painted gold and a note that said, "For the child losing teeth." These were not grand charity events. They were tiny economies of tenderness that made the afternoons tolerable and sometimes, for a sliver of time, joyful. Marigold aged. The orange was slightly dulled at the edges. Her purrs slowed, deeper now. She still could make herself into a compact sun on Sam's lap. She would still journey out at dusk and return at dawn with an item in her mouth. But sometimes, she would come home and collapse under the bookshelf and sleep twice as long. Sam learned to approach her slower, with softer hands. He learned to watch for small signs. The limping he had noticed now became a concern he mentioned to Mateo. They took her to a kind man's clinic one Saturday. Luis volunteered to walk her. There, and someone gave her a clean bill and a gentle medicine. They stitched the small wound on her paw and cleaned a little infection. Marigold complained with a sound that made Sam think she would prefer to object than to be made humanly safe. He found himself carrying her home wrapped loosely in a towel, like a child in a scarf. The tin continued to collect and distribute. The ledger spread. More neighbors asked to be included. They set up a system of notes and tags and a board where people could pin a description of what they had lost and where they had been. It became, in a way no one had planned, a civic good. People who had moved through the area for years realized they'd been neighbors to each other, but had not been present. They began to talk. They began to share stories of Elena, of the way she had stitched things through the neighborhood like breadcrumbs. They told the story of the scarf and how it had been found in the tin and returned to Sam. They told the story of the photograph and of how Elena had written the list. They told even the small, mundane stories about the moth, about the shoelace, about the astronaut sock. Each story was a stone laid across the stream of loneliness. Time did not make grief dissolve, it made it softer, not smaller, softer. Sam still missed Elena every day. He woke sometimes with a blank ache and had to walk around the house like a person checking for leaks. But now those walks were less like inspections and more like rounds. He checked the thermostat and the plant and the wooden box with the socks. He checked the porch light and the bowl by the door that once had been empty and now had dry food. He spoke out loud sometimes when he made tea. He told Elena the silly things that had happened that day. He told her about the kid with the rocket and the old man's new button. Sometimes he thought he heard her laugh back in the way Marigold flicked her tail. The final gift came in a way he had not expected. Not as a letter this time. Not as a ritual. It came as a small, late winter morning did, sudden and bright. A young woman he had seen around the courtyard, newly moved in, with a baby carriage and a tired smile, approached him one day as he was folding a list of tags. She had a small, crumpled envelope in her hand. She looked like someone who had been building the courage to say something for a while. "Mr. Sam?" she asked, voice like a thread. He looked up and recognized the face as a woman who had been seen on the bench across from the clinic. She had left a note in the wreath of the tin once and had tied a blue ribbon where the bus driver switched lanes. "Yes," he said. She thrust the envelope toward him as if it contained a small life. "It's for you," she said. He took it, puzzled. On the front, in a child's looping hand, was written 2 words. For Sam. He opened it with the cautious luck of a man opening a small box. Inside was a tiny drawing, not a formal thing, a crayon sun with a stick figure family under it. Beside the stick figures, someone had scrawled, "Dad, Mom, Rocket." It was the boy's work, the Rocket Kid, but there was more. Folded inside the drawing was a short note from the woman. She had been at the hospital the day Elena was there, she wrote. She had seen Sam from across the corridor, always with that far-off look that belonged to a man learning to survive things that do not make sense. She had left a scarf in the tin. Once, Elena's scarf, she guessed, because the scent was like a small, unlatched door. She had taken it out months later when she felt the house would need it. She had wanted only to say thank you. Thank you for being the person who showed up. Thank you for letting the cat in. Thank you for teaching the neighborhood how to keep. Sam folded the note and the drawing and laid them flat in his palm. A little hand had scribbled the words, "Thank you," in heavy capitals. He felt the inside of his chest move like a curtain. He felt that small, warm shape return. The feeling of having been seen in your most ragged state and still found worthy of help. That afternoon, he walked home with the paper pressed to his sternum. The sky had the patient, bruised look of late winter. Marigold met him at the door and dropped, without ceremony, a sock at his feet. It was ordinary. It was perfect. The sock had a little tooth mark at the cuff. He bent and picked it up and laughed, quiet and wet. He fed Marigold her dinner. He patted her until she purred, bright as an engine. Months became a loop of small rituals. He read Elena's letter when the nights were too long and he needed a map. He recorded a few simple notes in Mateo's ledger one Saturday and added a tag, "Sam, checking in, thanks." He learned how to mend socks. He learned which ribbons faded fastest in the sun. He learned to make tea for others. He learned to be held. His son came over one afternoon. The boy was older now by a measure of weighted years. He had questions Sam could not answer yet, and a laugh that still made Sam forget himself. They sat on the stoop and folded planes together. The boy's hands were clumsy and honest. He took the astronaut sock in his pocket, like a small way of carrying home something that was no longer lost. They did not repair everything that afternoon. They did not need to. They made a list of small next things, like ducklings on a pond. The ledger remained an instrument of small reconciliations. People found lost bank cards and family photos. They reunited a woman with a long-lost recipe book, the pages stained and warm with flour residue. They found a wedding ring and a loaf of bread. They placed a small paper crane with a note that said, "For rainy days." All of it accumulated into something like a community practice. Neighbors started leaving spare keys at the tin. They entrusted one another with small errands. People visited one another's windows more. Sam found that his house room held more laughter than the ghost of silence it had once been. Elena's scarf faded with time. It was a soft kind of fading that felt like the way memories soften into gentler shapes instead of sharp knife edges. He draped it over a chair in the front room sometimes so that its scent would lift into the air on winter nights. He would fold it into his coat pocket and take it out on certain mornings just to breathe its lemoned breathing. It never healed all the wounds. It never was intended to. It kept them warm. Marigold grew slower. Her leaps were measured. She preferred the sun on the sill and the whisper of Sam's hand in the late afternoon. He sat with her now, present and quiet, and he thought often of Elena, and her lists and the way she had not left him by accident. He thought of Mateo and Rosa and Luis and Mr. Cautry and the boy with the action figure. He thought of the woman who had left the thank you drawing. He thought of all the tiny exchanges. He felt held by them, and he learned how to hold in return. One clear morning, when the air had that crispness that nudges lungs into slow hymns, Sam climbed the small steps to the tin and looked across the courtyard. Neighbors had put up tiny lights for a festival of plates, leftovers and pies and bread. Children ran in loops. Someone played a radio on low. People brought chairs and sat down. Sam stood for a few moments in that sun and watched a man hand a small wrapped cookie to a woman wearing a coat with a missing button. She laughed when she found the button sewn into the hem of the wrap. He thought of Elena and how she would have liked that particular little vindication. He thought of all the invisible kinds of keeping happening among them. He had a new habit now. When he walked the route Elena had written down, clinic bench, bus, stop, postbox, he left a small note inside each sock he found, a line or two. Sometimes it read simply, "You are seen." Sometimes, "We are keeping this for you." Sometimes, "Bring it back when you can." He learned not to pass judgment on anyone's timing. People are ready when they are ready. He'd come to see that as a kind of mercy. There are truths that become obvious only after you have practiced them a long time. One of them is that grief changes shape. Another is that trust is a muscle that must be used. A third is that small acts matter. A sock in the doorway, a ribbon on a lamppost, a tin in a courtyard. Taken together, they are the scaffolding people climb up when the scaffolding of their lives has crumbled. In the end, the final gift was not a thing. It was a world. Not the entire world, of course. Just a neighborhood-sized world. A smaller world than the vast grief. But a world with doors and keys and a tin in the middle where people could keep things until they were ready to hold them again. It was a world where a cat could be the vector of care. It was a world where a woman could teach by example how to be held. It was a world with places to leave your socks so a stranger could hand them back. Sam learned to live with absence and presence braided together. He learned to be available to others the way he had been demanding of himself. He learned to show up, not heroically, but simply. He became, in the way small communities do, another person responsible for the ledger. Sometimes he swept the stoop. Often he tied ribbons at dusk. He smiled at the boy who folded planes with the exact same impatience Sam had once had. He handed out tea in half cups, thick and sugar-heavy, and better for it. On nights when the house felt like a dent left in the world, he would take Elena's letter and read only the line that mattered most in that moment. Sometimes it was, "We were never meant to hold everything alone." Sometimes it was, "Bring the kid's cap from the clinic." Sometimes it was the whole folded page, read like a litany. The cat lived with them all, more domestic now. She had earned the right to be both a public figure and a private companion. She was the ward of many hands. She had a basket by Rosa's window and a small plush lion the boy had found in the trash and repainted. When she died, suddenly, quietly, in the kind way many beloved things do, an entire courtyard attended. A small grave was dug at the edge of the community garden. They placed a smooth stone and tied ribbons in a circle around it. Sam planted a small patch of lavender there. He cried, of course. He also laughed because mourning had room for both. The ledger remained. The people remained. Marigold's work continued in cycles carried on by those she had taught, literally and by example. Years later, when the boy with the action figure was 19 and had a band in a city 2 hours away, he still came back on holiday. He would drag a friend through the courtyard and point to the tin like a proud archivist. The tin had become more precious that way, an old friend's way of proving things to the new. Sam would sit on his stoop and watch all of it, and sometimes think of Elena and smell lemon and gardenias on a passing breeze that might or might not have been memory recollecting itself like an old photograph. The ledger did not fix everything. Bills remained in the mailbox. Cups still went unwashed occasionally. The boy still made the wrong choices sometimes. But the world around Sam had a texture he could live inside. He could exist among people who remembered that small things carry heavy meanings. He had been given back a life stitched by neighbors and held together by small mercies. He had been given back a reason to wake and fold and leave and return. He had been given back the capacity to give and be given to. On evenings when he felt brave or when the house felt like it needed a ritual, he would take a sock from the wooden box he had kept since the first night and carry it down to the tin. He would place it carefully in the lid. He would tie a note reading, "For Sam, keeps." He would step back and let someone else find it if now was their time. Sometimes the sock remained a week. Sometimes it returned to him with a tag. Found. Thank you. Either way, the act was what mattered. The exchange. There is a truth about survival that is rarely said outright. It is this: healing is often less about making the pain disappear and more about building new things to carry it. The tin carried socks. The neighborhood carried grief in small, manageable parts. Neighbors carried each other's stories like coils of rope. Sam carried Elena's scarf in winter and a folded letter in his drawer, and he carried on. The last chapter of their story did not arrive in a grand moment of miraculous closure. It arrived in the ordinary manner it always had: a quiet morning, a cup of tea, a thin light on the pavement. Sam stood in the doorway and watched the children dart across the street. A girl with pigtails tripped and a sock escaped from her shoe. Marigold, gone years now, was a memory, but the practice remained. Sam stooped and picked up the sock and tacked it to a lamppost with a folded note. Held. Will be here. He smiled because he knew someone would find it. He walked back inside with the smell of lemon on his fingers. He had learned to keep and be kept. He had learned the tender economy of small things. He had learned that love doesn't always shout. Sometimes it leaves an envelope in a tin and trusts other hands to find it. He kept Elena's letter in a drawer. He took it out sometimes and read the line that mattered, and then he would fold it back and return it to the wood. He never felt finished with the reading. He never wanted to. It was a good kind of hunger. The ledger continued. People continued to lose things and to leave them and to find them again. Socks kept arriving at his door like small clocks. They told him the time in a language that made sense to his new way of breathing. There is a last thing to say, and it is as soft as a well-worn sock. People get broken, they get mended, sometimes by themselves, often by other people who may be strangers at first, but who are not strangers for long. The map Elena left was not only for Sam. It was for anyone who needed a language for small salvations. It taught that the world will hold you if you let pieces of it in. It taught that you could keep giving when you thought you had nothing left. It taught that the measure of a life is often in the quietness of shared cups and open tins. He learned to love the small things again. He learned to forgive his own absences. He learned the sound of Marigold's footfalls even after she was gone. He learned that a sock, folded and placed with care, can be an epigraph to a story that keeps going. You stayed till the end. Thank you. If it felt like a soft hug or a warm purr in your heart, subscribing lets me bring you more moments like this.